Great to be with all of you, those of you who want a little foreign policy sprinkled into your granola. There are fewer and fewer. Richard, I thought we're with Richard Haass. Richard, of course, had the best job in government, next to maybe all the jobs Larry Summers had, but the best job in government I've always thought was policy planning at the State Department, because it allowed you to think big, get out of things. Richard is now president of the Council on Foreign Relations, has had a variety of roles advising presidents, many different presidents in different parties, and has emerged as one of the most sage, listened to voices. He's often a voice that's iconoclastic, against the grain, and he has, if you read any of his books, which I'm a groupie of his, and read the books that he's written, they're always filled with principles on how to think smartly about foreign policy. And I thought, rather than jumping into ISIS in Iraq or Africa or this weed or that weed, which we can get into.
We can talk about weed in Colorado is a big subject.
Right, weeds in Colorado. I thought we'd kind of go up and talk a little bit about sort of national security strategy. And the big question, Richard, and let's just start there, is what would a healthy, smart foreign policy for America look like? Now, don't talk about what we have today, but what are the principles of a smart, healthy foreign policy?
Well, implicit in what you said, Steve, and thank you for what you did say, is that we don't quite have it today, and we don't. We'll probably get to that in a few minutes. I would say a couple of things would be the elements of a smart foreign policy. One, and you and I have talked about it at great length, is I do think that we need to be involved in the world as much as we need to be, but we don't want to be involved in the world right now more than we need to be, because we do need to repair big aspects of the home front, whether it's levels of economic growth, infrastructure, deal with many of the challenges facing American society, not as an end in itself, though these are fully worthy ends. But if you think about it as one side of the national security coin, therefore we have the domestic foundation to do all that we want to do in the world. So one thing we've got to do is get the domestic foundation right. To use the title of my last book, foreign policy needs to begin at home, it can't end there. So we do have to do things abroad. And I would think the big strategic concept in the world ought to be to encourage certain kinds of behaviors, encourage institutions that would reinforce them. And then I think you have to go down from 36,000 feet a little bit lower, but I would just say two or three things. One is in Asia, where you have the emergence of great power, competition, and rivalry, somewhat reminiscent of Europe a century ago, is we've got to help the locals put into place the shock absorbers and the institutions in order to manage what I think are growing rivals. I would say that's the biggest strategic challenge.
So buffers to handle the rise of China.
The emergence of what you might call a post World War II Japan, rise of nationalism. Asia for 3 decades has almost been one-dimensional as a phenomenal economic success story.
I mean, for those of you who haven't watched, Japan and Prime Minister Abe just yesterday have come out and really done another big leap forward in defining what they'll do militarily, which is may not sound shocking to you, but coming to the aid of allies is something that the Article 9. So that talks about the sort of post World War II.
And you've got all these economic groups, but you really haven't kept the pace with political, military, diplomatic institutions or relationships in the Asia Pacific. And the danger is you've got tremendous military increases. You've got rising nationalism. And I think you've got more issues over territory and sea space that have never been resolved. Plus, you've never had anything in Asia akin to what you have in Europe, which is Franco-German reconciliation. The reason the second half of the 20th century in Europe looked different than the first half is you had Franco-German reconciliation. Those were the cause of 2 world wars. It didn't happen again. In Asia, you've never had Sino-Japanese reconciliation. You've never had other forms of reconciliation between Japan and Korea, China, Vietnam. And it's the lack of the political relationships and then the institutions, which I would say, again, a big strategic challenge for the United States. We can talk about what to do about the turmoil in the Middle East, what to do and what not to do about Europe. But essentially, I would say the biggest goal for the United States conceptually is to keep order in the world.
Richard, this may be a kind of a gross characterization of you by some others, but a lot of time people would identify you as a classic national security guy. But you were just talking about economic. Your book, Foreign Policy Begins at Home: The Case for Putting America's House in Order, was really started, and it read a lot like President Obama's first national security strategy report, talking about economics. We have Larry Summers sitting here in the front, and not to use Larry as too much of a pawn in this, but there's been a big sea change in the way foreign policy is conceived and thought of. You have people like Ben Stile, Sebastian Mallaby, Ted Alden, others thinking about economic issues at the Council on Foreign Relations, but that's not the way it's been for a long time. You've been somebody saying, it's not just your guns and armies and national security positioning, but economics matters in a huge way.
Oh yeah, geo-economics is as important as geopolitics. One, for the reason we already talked about, which is that's the resource foundation of what it is you do. But take any number of crises. Take Ukraine. The single most important foreign policy instrument the United States may have is working with the IMF and the EU in bolstering what has historically been a fairly dysfunctional economy. Well, take what I think is the most interesting strategic development of the last 5 years, which is the America going from energy scarcity to energy self-sufficiency, and we're probably on the edge of energy abundance. Mm-hmm. What are the strategic consequences of that? How does that give us greater cushion as we go about navigating the world? So I don't think, the line we tend to use is universities have departments, the right. world doesn't. Mm-hmm. So you can't think of it as economics, politics, military. It just doesn't work that way.
So let's jump to the president's foreign policy. So now you've laid out some of the terms of what a smart and healthy foreign policy would look like. What would you give President Obama by way of a university grade for his foreign? What would you give?
Well, if we were at Harvard, he'd get an A, because everyone at Harvard gets an A. But we're not at Harvard, so he doesn't get an A. I think he gets pretty rough marks and pretty low marks, and I'd say it's for two sides. One is there were two big ideas, or three big ideas to the Obama foreign policy. One was that nation building begins at home, to do more in the United States. And I would simply say that was the bias, but it hasn't been implemented. We can talk about it whatever length you want, but there isn't a domestic agenda that has been sufficiently ambitious. Not only the president's fault, Congress obviously has a lot to do with it, but that's one part. The second big idea was to dial down in the Middle East. And I think he's done that in some ways all too much. And I sense we went from a president who did too much in that part of the world to a president who now does too little. And we pay a price for that. And thirdly, he had a big idea. The other big idea of the Obama presidency was to do more in Asia, the so-called pivot or rebalance to Asia. But the problem there is not the idea. I think it's a really good idea. We just haven't done it. It hasn't been implemented. I used to teach at the Kennedy School, and we used to tell the students policy design is about 10% and policy implementation is 90%. And every once in a while, I think the problem with the president is he went to the law school and not the Kennedy School. And he's too enamored with policy design and not enough with policy implementation. And as a result, we simply haven't made the pivot real.
How much of this do you think is really his fault? When you think about how a superpower plays in the world, militarily, economically, through institutions, morally, you think about the different things. George W. Bush invaded Iraq, and that invasion, which I know you've been very critical, you've called it a war of choice, really in a way showed the United States at military limits. You used to go around the world and people thought America had no military limits. It became very clear that there were limits. And the consequence of that, I think, is that your allies won't count on you as much anymore because they know you're overextended. Economically, the subprime crisis made it look like it was harder for the United States to guide other economies or tell other economies what to do. Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo certainly placed a lot of moral doubt about American leadership in the world. All of that preceded Barack Obama coming to office, and all of those are really, really big issues. And then when you look at the institutions we have in the world, which were World War II institutions on the whole, some others, there hasn't been that much revision in which the United States could have played a premium or gotten a premium for being an architect of a sort of new global social contract. So when you look at those issues, maybe I would blame Obama on the institutional side, but the other stuff preceded him.
Sure, but...
And you were in that administration. I would love to sort of hear what you feel. I mean, if the strategic contraction of the United States, was it inevitable given what it set up?
The answer is no, and also one has to be more discriminating about where you contract and how. But look, it's fair to say this president inherited a rough inbox for all the reasons you mentioned, though Iraq by that point had fairly well stabilized. But the financial crisis and all the consequences of that, I think those are the two overwhelming inheritances. What this president did on the financial side, I think, with Larry, Tim Geithner, and others, I think it gets fairly high marks. We look very good compared to how the Europeans responded to their version of it. There's other things, again, we can and should have done on top of that, but that's a conversation perhaps for another day. I think this president was too concerned with getting out of the Middle East as a strategic end in itself, much too preoccupied with calendars rather than conditions, and thinking about that. I also think in many cases, someone should have banned the words regime change from the White House. Way too anxious to bring about change. It kind of had a liberal interventionist.
So the Assad has to go thing.
Mubarak has to go, Assad has to go, Gaddafi has to go, without thinking, well, if he were, one, what will it take for him to go? And second of all, what will it take for us to put something better in its place? And if you're only interested in going and not replacing something that's enduringly better, then that's not a serious strategy. That's reckless. And I think what we have to show in large parts of the Middle East is areas where we had a liberal interventionist impulse. But it conflicted with Mr. Obama's desire to put a lid or a limit on America's involvement in the Middle East. We have this strange disconnect between widely ambitious goals in the Middle East, but a commitment to keeping down what it is we're committed to. You can't run a public policy, much less a foreign policy, where you have wildly ambitious ends and wildly modest and constrained means. That is what we have in the Middle East.
So we've got to take it. The president announced just yesterday that he was going to add 200 more military to those that I think numbers now up to those authorized to 775 over the last 2 weeks. So I'd like to know what the Richard Haass critique of that would be. If you were in the White House, what would you be recommending? So we're up to about 800. Things look
well, here's my problem.
Fragile.
Here's my question with what we're doing in Iraq, which is, what is the ultimate purpose? What is our definition of success here, and do we think it's achievable? Are we trying to basically put Humpty Dumpty back together again? Do we think the best vehicle for the United States and Iraq...
Humpty Dumpty is Iraq.
Iraq.
Yeah.
And do we think that that we have the chance to recreate an intact whole Iraq? And if we were to do so, that would be desirable. And let me simply suggest, I don't think we have a good chance of doing it, and I'm not at all sure it's desirable. I don't think we have a good chance. I think the degree of fissure within Iraq, it maybe was not in Iraq's DNA, but it was latent in it there, and it's been brought out because of successive years of war and governance and terrible governance and sectarianism. I simply don't think you can have a society now where Kurds and Shia and Sunni are going to live in harmony. You would have to have a Shia-dominated Iraq, and that means Iran will have a very, very heavy hand. So I don't think you'll have a situation where Iraqis will allow it. And I'm not sure strategically why we should want to bring about an Iraq that would be Shia, i.e. Iranian dominated. I just don't get it.
So this is a very profound, what you're basically saying is let it go.
Well, not yet.
But
yes.
Yeah. John Kerry told Maliki, our support is dependent on you coming up with a new government, and that didn't happen yesterday, right? So
yesterday was a fiasco. Right. It was one of those terrible deja vu moments yesterday. I don't know how many of you had it. You read the New York Times, and whose name appears? Ahmed Shalabi, as one of the possible successors to Maliki. Come on. This is the guy who oversaw de-Baathification.
Right.
He had his list. This is the guy who obviously was involved in other aspects before the war began. What the political class and the Shia political elite, you're not going to get somebody who is going, I believe, who's going to create an independent Iraq, independent of Iran, and who's going to create something that other Iraqis will want to live with. So what I would say is the following. We should strengthen the independent Kurdish entity within the borders of Iraq. But I think the Kurds, by the way, in about an hour.
Within the borders of Iraq.
Within the borders of Iraq. And Kurds took Kirkuk. For over a decade, you've had this major source of contention between the Kurds and the Iraqi central government. That disappeared in about an hour the other day. And they're never giving it back. Kirkuk is never going back to the central government. You now have a de facto Kurdish state. The deal we should make is you should be content with this Kurdish state inside your own borders rather than trying to take in the Kurds beyond the
Netanyahu and
borders.
even the Turkish government and even Hillary Clinton said they deserve their own state.
Right.
Now their own state sounds different than an autonomous region within another state.
That's why the plan for Iraqi federalism and other has been overtaken by events. We are not talking about federalism. We're talking about the breakup of Iraq. So I think essentially you've got a greater Baghdad south that's Shia dominated, heavy Iranian hand. I don't particularly like it, it's a fact of life. You've got an independent Kurdish area in the north that I believe we should strengthen. And the goal should be to treat the northwest of Iraq and big parts of the southern swath of Syria as this basically area where there's no legitimate, responsible sovereign control. And we ought to treat that the same way we treat parts of Pakistan, parts of Yemen, parts of Afghanistan, parts of Libya. These are no man's lands. And what we ought to do is, rather than necessarily coordinating our policy with an Iraqi government, we ought to treat this in the same way that we carry out counter-terrorist actions in other parts of the world, 10, 15, 20 other countries, and we ought to have a serious concerted counter-terrorism effort against ISIS in this area that crosses two borders. And we ought to recreate some pressure on ISIS in Syria, which is one of the arguments for doing more there, so ISIS doesn't have the luxury of just using Syria as a base and turning all of its attention to Iraq.
Now, Richard, a lot of these countries, whether it's Syria, whether it's now looking more and more like Iraq or Afghanistan, or you've got deep, often religious, but deep cultural, ethnic divides in the country, and essentially what everybody else would call a civil war. I don't know why we don't want to call it civil wars, but civil wars on top of which you seem to have proxy wars or proxy interests.
Exactly right.
And so when you try to get in and say we're going to send $500 million to arm a vetted opposition, it seems to miss the larger picture that there are meddlers all around. And oftentimes these meddlers look like the same cast in country after country. So what has inhibited us from sort of being more realistic about that? I mean, that the solution inside these countries, even the governments inside these countries don't have control over their borders and what's happening internally. How do you deal with the meddling problem?
Okay, take 30 seconds on the Senate, because I think Steve has it about right. The closest analog to what you're seeing in the greater Middle East today is early 17th century Europe. A time of political, religious upheaval, prolonged wars within and across borders. And it was called the 30 Years' War, basically a prolonged Protestant Catholic struggle in Europe that went from basically 1618 or so to 1648. Ended in the Treaty of Westphalia, which gave rise, interestingly enough, to the modern state system. What we're seeing, though, in the Middle East is just the opposite. We're seeing conflict that is not, if you will, leading to a state system, but is basically, I think, undermining the existing state system, which really goes back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement 100 years ago. You know, what we want to do is basically be quite selective in where and how we intervene. I think we had opportunities in Syria that we didn't take advantage of. We now have much worse opportunities. They'll be slow in developing, but we probably want to do a little bit there. We want to strengthen the Kurds. We want to strengthen Jordan, which is feeling an enormous refugee burden, but also potentially a political military challenge from ISIS. What we want to do is continue to work with the Saudis, repair that relationship. We ought to negotiate with Iran on the nuclear, and I think we ought to cooperate with Iran where we can, for example, on Afghanistan. We're soon going to have a new government in Afghanistan that's going to be challenged in all sorts of ways. The Iranians, and I was one of the representatives of the United States at the time, after 9/11, when we had a new post-Taliban government, the Iranians took a large and responsible role. They have a stake in a stable Afghanistan. We ought to have a kind of one-off approach. Where we can work with the Iranians, we should. Where we can't, we won't. And just go about the Middle East with a not all or nothing take, but just decide where, not so much where our interests are, that's obvious, but also where we think involvement, we can get some results that justify the involvement.
That sounds so sensible, but when you then play it out in the American media...
That's why I have no future. I realize
that. I would dispute that. But it sounds so sensible, but take ISIS and Iraq, whether or not you thought Iraq was savable or not. What was interesting in the media, what got reported, and what the White House had to react to, was whether or not they would work with the Iranians with Maliki inside Iraq. And the negativism in the American media was enormous. So do you think we have a media? I mean, one of the things you do, I listened to your global education seminar yesterday, and I'm just wondering whether or not we just have a deficit that understands some of these larger equities that we can't report responsibly in the media on some of these issues.
Look, it's tough, and anytime you try to do something that operates in the gray, you're going to get caricatured, and you're going to get hammered. And the good news, though, under our political system and our constitutional arrangements is presidents have extraordinary discretion on foreign policy. I mean, look, we pursued, whatever you thought of Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, presidents pursued incredibly costly wars, and costly by every measure, human and material and financial, for over a decade. If the president tomorrow wants to do all sorts of military strikes, he'll do them. If he wants to do all sorts of, if he doesn't want to do them, he won't do them. Look what he did on Syria a year ago, or didn't do on Syria. He has tremendous discretion. So, of all the areas where you ought not to be slavish to public opinion, I would actually say national security and foreign policy ought to be at the top of the list, because you have tremendous freedom of action.
One of the things I did a few years ago is saying if you wanted to look at the way the rest of the world looked at us and looked at U.S. power, don't look at our enemies, but look at our allies and see how their behavior is changing. And I decided to look at Japan and Germany, because we'd beaten both of them in World War II and essentially helped prop up and build their economies. And then Israel and Saudi Arabia, whom were rarely talked about in the same sentence at the time, but both were essentially strategic allies of the United States. And all four of them are behaving differently than they would have a decade ago. And all four of them are behaving differently in ways because they sense that when push comes to shove, U.S. power is not playing out like it used to.
I think there's two things at work. I think you're right. And I think there's two interesting things going on. One is, you might call it structural, and one is consequential. The structural is we're at a moment in history where simply power in various forms is more dispersed than it was. The United States, that's why I don't like phrases like superpower. We don't control the world. I don't like phrases like hegemon. There's a diffusion or a dispersal of power. So the Saudis, the Israelis, the Germans, the Japanese, and others, they have more independent foreign policies because there's simply limits to our ability to influence. And that's the structural. The consequential, though, is that either there are specific policy differences with us, or there's doubts about our reliability. And that as a result, the combination of the two, of policy divergent and doubts about American reliability, has led them in some ways to recalibrate their own security portfolios. And the combination of the structural and the consequential is we're beginning to see the emergence of a world which has many more independent centers of decision making, and I think on the spectrum is moving towards a more difficult to manage, less orderly planet. And I think we're seeing that in all sorts of ways, but it's going to be harder and harder to organize collective responses to challenges. And again, some of it is our own doing. I actually think the single most consequential decision of the president was not to use force against Syria a year ago over the chemical weapons. After he had marched things up, announced the red lines, said he had the authority to act, and then said he was still going to go to Congress for the authority to act. It didn't just have consequences for the Middle East, but many Asian and other leaders have spoken to me and talked about it. That was one of those moments, and I think history will look back on it and say, where people said, this is a different United States.
But don't the 1,300 tons of chemical agents that have been taken out of the country...
That's a different issue. But you're looking at that in the narrow. That's the narrow on the seat chemical weapons thing, and we don't know what would have happened or not happened had we used force. That's a narrow calculation of the rightness or wrongness of the policy. What I'm talking about is the global perception of what that said about the relationship between what the United States said and what the United States was prepared to do. And we've paid a large price.
Well, and it goes into, that's a great frame, because while the world looked at it that way, the American public was basically saying, because I watched very closely Bob Corker. Bob Corker was a key player in that, and Bob Corker was prepared to support the White House. Eric Cantor came out, and that weekend, before they'd all gone home to their Labor Day parties and constituent meetings, and said, we're going to support the president, we're coordinating. And it was just a remarkable kind of bipartisan moment that preceded pulling the plug, because all of these congressmen went back and said, we're not going to get any support. So the American public, one of the questions I have, for you in certain sense, is that sort of the strategic high priests, people like you and others, often think that this stuff happens without having to go back and connect it to the American public and their priorities. And the American public pulled the plug on Syria.
Oh, I disagree 100%. The president had all the discretion and power and authority he needed. And if he had acted and it had gone well, it would have been fine. And if he had acted and it had gone well, it would have been political price to pay. But that's true whether he had a vote or not. We have a representative system. We don't have direct democracy. We're not California. We don't subject every foreign policy decision we have to a referendum or a plebiscite. We elect people, and we have a representative system, and we are meant to act that way. And yes, you sometimes have to exert leadership. You know, I worked for a president. I was at the White House for the 41st president, George Herbert Walker Bush, and he didn't look at the opinion polls. When the Iraqis took Kuwait, he led the charge, and we barely won the vote in the Senate at the time to use force to support the UN effort to kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And the president said, very interesting, when he sent the legislation up to the Hill, he did not ask for the authority to act. He said, I've got all the authority I need very much. I'm simply asking for your support and approval. And he made it clear, and I will go to my grave thinking that even if he had lost the vote in the Senate, he would have used military force to oust the Iraqis from Kuwait. That was simply his view of presidential power. And I tend to come from that school of a rather expanded view. You've then got to go into the court of public opinion and sell it. You've got to try to bring Congress along, but you can't govern here by polls, particularly now, because the inclination of the American people, in part because of intervention fatigue after these two expensive wars, in part because the persistent domestic economic challenges here at home, we are tilting in the direction of retrenchment. I won't use the isolationist word, but certainly towards retrenchment. So if you put things up, if you will, for popular votes, we're going to basically do nothing. But then one day we're going to end up, sooner rather than later, with a very messy world that the American people won't like either. So again, we pay our leaders to lead, shockingly enough.
You know, we're going to get to questions pretty soon, and I'm sure, I mean, there's so many things we talk about: Israel, Palestine, Syria, ISIS, Africa, and whatnot. But I want to hit a couple of big ones before we do that.
Also, we have to talk about Mexico for a second, because I
Mexico.
promised one person here that I wouldn't only be Debbie Downer.
Yes.
And
Yes.
the energy situation is a great positive, and I actually think what is going on in Mexico
This
and
is
North
historic.
America,
I've never heard him be positive.
and North America, but North America, just a second, this is a unit now of 450 million people. We are, I think, on the verge of energy. We are arrived at energy self-sufficiency. We have the potential to be the real economic engine of the world. And one of the priorities for American foreign policy ought to be a more integrated, consolidated North America, but Canada, United States, and Mexico. The upside of this trilateral relationship is enormous.
You know, one of the things I admired the Obama administration for looking at trying to get right is there was a period, and again, not to come back to Larry, but Larry Summers went to China in September of 2010 with Tom Donilon, because the White House saw how things were going, were not moving in a healthy direction. That if you looked militarily, economically, things were just screwed up. And so they took this on themselves and said, this is too important a relationship to let kind of stumble forward. Now, whether or not that is, China's a tough challenge. But I'd love to sort of see from you whether you think we're getting China right. We've had air defense zone problems, but Japan has been finding, you know, its own nationalist route. How would you maneuver it? It's such a hard problem, but I do think the Obama administration has put a lot of time and effort into China.
Certainly in the first term, we put a lot of effort into it. Less now. There's no one who's quite taken the role of Hillary Clinton or Tom Donilon or Kurt Campbell at the next level down. So there's not the same.
So no one owns it?
No one owns it. And it's very, when everybody owns it, nobody owns it. Nobody owns Asia policy. It's one of the reasons the pivot is more rhetorical than real. We haven't had the sustained diplomatic involvement. We've not increased our air and naval forces. And I'm not confident, even if we can negotiate an Asia trade deal, that we can get it through the Congress. And I'm not sure how much political capital the administration is prepared to do that. And without all that, the pivot is empty. And I think what you're beginning to see from the Japanese is their sense that they need to hedge against that.
Right.
And you're beginning to see, again, greater independent action coming out of Tokyo. Look, the U.S.-Chinese relationship is arguably the most important of this era of history. It's incredibly complicated just because we've got to be engaged with them enough. At the same time, we've also got to be more competitive, and we've got to hedge against their emergence in certain ways. We've got to be supportive of our friends. but we can't give our friends a blank check. So getting this right, squaring all these circles is going to be tough, but on the other hand, there is a degree of interdependence between the United States and China. I would think actually the biggest question, in some ways even bigger than a US foreign policy towards China, might be China's own domestic trajectory. And I would say as tough as Mr. Obama's inbox is, it doesn't even compare to Xi Jinping's. If you look at, you've got much lower levels of economic growth, and the numbers being talked about by the Chinese are artificial numbers. The real growth, I think, is far below that. You've got the demographic consequences of the one-child policy. You've got water and environmental problems. You've got corruption. That's not a problem, but that is systemic. Most of the low-hanging fruit of economic reform has been picked. You still have hundreds of millions of people in rural areas. You've got the political problems of party versus state and society. These are enormous challenges, and without the lubricant of high economic growth, the question is how will China manage its own future? I think we're going to see, we're already beginning to see elements of crackdown in China. So managing this relationship against the backdrop of what I think will be a very bumpy era for the Chinese leaders it'll put a premium on diplomacy. And I would simply say I hope both governments are up to it.
And let me jump to Russia for a quick moment. Do you think it was a mistake not to create an on-ramp, even a long-term on-ramp for Russia to become a member of NATO, that it institutionalized them versus us? And it's okay to do that when Russia's a basket case, but when Russia feels rich, obviously it's going to, revert to muscle memory.
So you said one of the best jobs in government is policy planning, and I'm not so sure I agree with you, because one of the memos I wrote was why we should make Russia a member of NATO. And I basically argued that NATO as a collective had already become increasingly an a la carte organization. The NATO never did anything as all 26, 27, whatever the number is, members, that increasingly countries footnoted and opted out, and you had coalitions of the willing within it. So I said, why not then reassure Russia and bring them in, because you had certain things they were going to cooperate with us anyhow, where they wanted to, and they were going to oppose us where they wanted to. So to the extent we were working at reassurance.
So why didn't you win?
Well, that would have been the exception. I didn't win any arguments. I mean, in baseball, you get into Cooperstown if you win 1 out of 3. I couldn't have gotten within 100 miles of Cooperstown in my last stint in government. I think it's one of those ideas that's just a little bit too outside the box. And look, obviously some of the Eastern European countries didn't want it. The move to reassure Russia, to bring them into NATO, would have had a negative effect on countries like Poland and others who would have said, well, gee, when we wanted to get in, this was not what we thought it was going to be, a security relationship against Russia, no matter what else was said. So that wouldn't have been reassuring to them. It would have complicated some things. But I think it was just basically, it was too hard. I mean, we had the Partnership for Peace. And so the whole idea was, after the Cold War, using that. And then when we introduced NATO enlargement, which I think historians will debate about whether it was a good idea or not, we devalued the Partnership for Peace. And so then NATO enlargement up to Russia's borders it was a consequential decision with some cost. Now, whether Putin would have had almost as many resentments without that, your guess is as good as mine, maybe. So it's you can't replay history. But once we decided on the path of NATO enlargement, I think the argument, or at least the case for bringing Russia in, should have gotten more serious consideration than it did.
The other day I moderated George Mitchell and Anne-Marie Slaughter and Marwan Muasher in a talk on the Middle East, and Anne-Marie Slaughter was making parts of her case about American interventionism around some of the moral issues and the concern about the number of people that were dying in various places, the displaced persons being at a level historic highs really globally since the end of the Second World War. And George whacked back with this, said, if that is the measure by which you're doing, where are we in case after case after case in Africa? Does America have a compelling strategic interest that justifies deeper strategic involvement in any of the many bubbling problems in Africa? And as you answer that, Susan Rice has been generally concerned about Africa and wanting to show that Barack Obama owned more of the outcomes there than we have in the past. So is that a good thing, or is that a blind spot for the administration?
Two things to say. One is, in many cases, we may not have a vital national interest, but part of the luxury of being a great power is sometimes you're prepared to act even if you don't have a vital national or strategic interest. So you look at what you can usefully do. It may have nothing to do with military force, so you may do a little bit of military training and other things. It may have a lot to do with trade or economic support or what have you. So to me, again, you have to be prepared to dial responses. But I don't think we can be a kind of only when our vital national interests are at stake do we get involved. But when interests less than vital, you've got to then calibrate what it is you're prepared to dedicate and what sort of responses. I would just simply say about Africa it almost never comes up in these talks. Mm-hmm. It's a good few phrases. I actually think it's an area of the world of growing strategic importance. The demographics are interesting. You've probably, out of the 50 or so countries there, a good 20 are actually in a very positive place in terms of political and economic governance and reform. You've got a couple of really awful situations, which get the lion's share of the attention. But one of the interesting just sort of ways of looking at it, it's interesting to see how many American businesses are beginning to think much more about investment, private equity firms opening up Africa funds. This is a continent where I think the public perception has lagged significantly behind an emerging, an improving reality, and certainly one that's much more diverse than some of the perceptions. Same with Latin America. Both of these regions of the world, I would say, are significantly improved from where they were, say, 20 years ago.
Thank you. This really should be a 2-hour session, because when I think about Afghanistan or the other stands out there, and I think about U.S. power in the world, there's so many other things we get into. But I want some of you to get into those things. So let me open the floor. I'm going to ask people to make their questions short and brief, and your responses brief, so we can get as many on the table as we can. Right here. Do we have someone with the mic? There we go. This gentleman right here in the middle, and then we'll go to the left. My left.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question about Russia and their involvement in Syria and chemical weapons. From reports, I guess a lot of the weapons have been taken out of the country. Cooperation with Russia seemed to have worked. So can you talk a bit about why you think that was not a success for Obama because of the red line?
Well, I think it was a narrow success or large success in terms of the chemical weapons. But the decision not to use force, after all the things that preceded it, was a major
has bigger echo effect.
Climb down, and it transcended the immediacy of the chemical weapons. I also think the decision not to use force totally undermined any possible confidence for the Syrian opposition, and it dramatically worsened the chance, or undermined the chance, to change the momentum inside Syria. So I think it was, again, consequential.
Two quick things. Remember, the Syrians, they've 100% of the chemical agents are out of the country. 12 production facilities still exist that should have been dismantled. So it's important to remember the Syria deal is not done, and to think about that. But the other piece of this, which I think is important when you begin thinking about that, as you've said, we should have helped the moderate opposition in the future. I've gone back and tried to look at the timeline of what the FSA, or the precursors to the FSA. I've never been able to find a time where I thought the leadership was intact. Mm-hmm. So are we inventing a history that the moderate opposition was this cohesive, smart, capable entity that we could have actually helped? Is that a myth?
Well, if you set it that high, but
well, I mean, I said it pretty low.
We could have found people to help.
Yeah.
That's the CIA and the Pentagon both have a lot of experience with vetting, and look, we could have done it. We could have found some people. Some of the stuff we would have provided would have then gotten into the wrong hands, either because it would have gotten lost or sold, or some of the people we gave it to would have changed sides. So there would have been some leakage. Mm-hmm. So it would have been a risky and imperfect course of action, but always in life you got to say, compared to what?
Yeah, right here. In fact, there are two here, so we'll just take two quick, and then we'll jump this side.
I'd like to understand a little better how we can leverage our newfound energy abundance to further our foreign policy objectives abroad. And specifically, what would you recommend to President Obama in terms of how do we use this surplus, or this coming surplus, to further our
So how
own
does
agenda.
energy change the
Well,
game?
it's already changed things a bit. The fact that the United States, over the last couple of years, each year has produced 1 million barrels a day, more than the year before, led to downward pressure on oil prices. One of the reasons the Iranian sanctions worked as well as they did was because of the American energy experience over the last 4 or 5 years. It's already had some strategic effect. Going forward, I would take away any limits on our ability to export crude or natural gas. I would have a big energy project with the Europeans to reduce their long-term dependency upon Russia. I would go ahead with Keystone, which would very much help our North American relationship. It would not have environmental adverse
Do your
consequences.
insiders tell you that won't happen?
I do not hear that.
Okay.
And by the way, it would then make it less difficult for this president to confront people like Chancellor Merkel and the president of France to ask them to make difficult policy decisions in the energy realm. France won't allow fracking. Germany won't go ahead with nuclear. We ought to relook at our policy on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and what it's available for us. And I like the idea. I mean, to me, the most significant legislation of Mr. Obama's first term may not have, you can argue whether it was the Affordable Care Act, it could well have been the Energy Act. And doubling, CAFE standards, mileage standards, and the rest was a big piece of legislation, which, by the way, Congress and White House and Republicans and Democrats all worked together on. So I think there are some things we've done, and I think there are more things we can do.
This gentleman right here.
Hi, I'm in the venture capital industry, and I was
Be
curious.
bold about it.
I'm
in
bold
the
about
venture
it.
capital industry.
I work in technology, and I was curious about cyber attacks and cybersecurity.
Yeah.
In terms of the degree to which we're,
Right.
how well are we doing, and B, if we think about corporations, for instance, in China that are stealing intellectual property, there's sort of a crossover between foreign policy departments of the university, et cetera.
Let me make a general point about it. When I first came to Aspen, it was in the 70s, and that was already 20 years into the nuclear debate. The nuclear debate really grew up in the 50s, intellectually. And you had the mathematicians, the physicists, the foreign policy types, and this whole discipline of arms control and how to think about this new technology called nuclear weapons. We're at a similar point now with cyber. New technologies have been introduced into the world, and we don't have the ideas, we don't have the vocabulary, we certainly don't have the frameworks for structuring it or managing it. And it's far more complicated, it turns out, than the nuclear, because there's many more sources. It's innovating much more quickly. So I would just simply say, intellectually, this is the Wild West of cyber. And we don't begin to
Do you
have...
see a Herman Kahn out there on cyber?
No, I don't know. I haven't seen it yet. And I've actually made it one of the real priorities at the Council on Foreign Relations is to try to provide some of the intellectual frameworks for how to think through. In the meantime, cyber theft is profound, and it's a real issue. One other issue, so the answer is we're vulnerable. We're massively vulnerable. We're getting attacked. Since this meeting began, there's probably been hundreds of thousands of cyber attacks against individuals and corporations and government entities in this country. My own institution gets attacked with a degree of frequency that is alarming. The amount I assume Aspen does, or any place, you now have to spend on cyber protection. It's the fastest growing parts of lots of budgets. I just say one of the big things to watch in the world is going to take place this October and November in South Korea, in the city Busan. And you're going to have a meeting, an international meeting of the group, it's the International Telegraphic Union, or Telecommunications Union, the ITU. And this is the regulatory oversight agency that now deals with the internet. And the internet has essentially grown up from the bottom up, stakeholders and the rest, and it's kind of been self-regulated. And for the first time in the world, we have powerful pushback from governments that want to run the internet, because they're worried about it, because ideas travel across the internet, and ideas can be dangerous for authoritarian governments. People see the internet as favoring American corporations. For the first time, the battle is joined in the world, which is what is going to be the nature of the internet. Who's going to own it? Who's going to run it? We could very well, in 5 years, have multiple fragmented internets. Almost going back to the age when trains had to stop and change the connecting, the gauge and so forth. We could be moving to a world which is actually going in the opposite direction of the technology.
Eric Schmidt and Jarrett Cohen, in their book, talk about it as one of their
Right.
greatest fears.
Yeah.
That actually then, whoever controls that subject controls truth, controls how borders look like, controls how history is told.
This is a big battle, and
Yeah.
it hasn't gotten the attention it deserves. But I actually think this is it's part of a larger problem of reality in the world where there's a gap between global rules and institutions on one hand and global challenges. We see it in climate change, we see it in disease management, and now we're seeing it in this area of internet governance.
Let me take these last. If we do them super fast,
I'm sorry,
we'll grab them.
I'm talking too long.
I've got a hook. Somebody's got a hook here, and they're going to grab me, but
Are
real
we, going,
fast.
are we going to be able to work with the Russians on any discrete foreign policy issues, or are we back to the 70s where Putin's just
Yeah.
going to take the
I think
other
it's a big
side
issue.
of whatever we do?
It's a really big issue, and again, at the risk of being controversial, I think we need to be and we should be, but that means we do not introduce linkage. What that means is we have to decide whether we tell the Russians, we disagree with you so much over Ukraine and Crimea, we're not going to work with you elsewhere unless you change your policy there, or we have to decide we disagree with you here, we're going to react, but still, we're going to try to limit the spillover so we can still work with you, say on Iran or North Korea or Afghanistan. We have got to make that strategic decision.
Do you think we overplayed our hand on Ukraine? I mean, you talked about the president not talking about regime change, but an awful lot of hyperventilation went into the Ukraine-Crimea issue. Crimea was still annexed. It's still in a vice. But it looked as if it was all the eggs in one basket
I
strategy.
think we've both underplayed it and overplayed it.
Yeah.
I would have done more help for Ukraine in certain ways. I would not have necessarily done exactly the approach on sanctions. But I think with Russia, we've got to decide whether Ukraine and Crimea are a one-off or whether this presages a whole new realm of Russian foreign policy and therefore how we want to adjust.
Great question. Right here? God, she's popping up in exactly the right places.
Does Iran get the bomb?
I have 0 minutes. Does Iran get the bomb?
Look, the most likely outcome, I think Iran is going to stop short of that. And the real question is, can you come up with an approach that's quote unquote enough for Iran and not too much for ourselves and the Israelis? Whether you can find that sweet spot, I don't know. The deadline is coming up. We're days away from it in July now. I think one of the things we have to think about is everyone talks about success or failure. Let me suggest there's a third possibility, which is neither. And that whether we're prepared for extending the interim agreement, and if so, what are the terms? What do we demand of Iran? What, if anything, are we willing to provide in the way of sanctions relief? But I believe we need to start thinking, rather than simply a binary choice, we may need to think about a prolonged negotiation and how to manage this challenge.
Folks, I apologize to everybody not in this, but I think we've had a really nice treatment of global issues, strategy. I remember David Petraeus, who's on campus testifying before Richard Lugar on some issues related to Afghanistan, and Senator Lugar asked him if how he felt about the sort of the broader strategy, and Petraeus said, that's not my job. My job is Afghanistan. I'm not discussing strategy. And I found a very interesting comment because so often we talk about these countries one by one, almost silos unto themselves, without looking at kind of the larger interconnectedness of things. So, Richard, thanks for taking us into the interconnectedness of things. Richard Haas, thank you so much.